Today we are speaking with Dr. Paul Mullins, a historic archaeologist at IUPUI who studies the relationship between racism and material culture. Hey Paul, how are you doing today?
Very good, thank you.
Can you tell me a little bit about your research?
My research in Indianapolis focuses primarily on the predominantly African American community that once lived where the IUPUI campus is and along Indiana Avenue, and I'm interested in the establishment of that community, the diversity of folks that lived in the near west side, and I'm especially interested in their displacement after World War II by highway construction, state expansion, and of course the construction of the university itself.
And for those who may not know, you mentioned the building of the interstates through downtown Indianapolis. I understand that's called redlining. Can you speak a little bit about that?
Well, what happened, redlining is a 1930s phenomenon done by the Homeowners Loan Corporation. And in the 1930s, all major American cities were divided up by what the federal government referred to as risk for loan default. And if you were a community that had a single African American, then you were classed so low that you could not get a federal loan. So that's what referred to. And on those maps, those neighborhoods were red, hence redlining. So those neighborhoods were predominantly African American, and that's true certainly in Indianapolis. We have a map done in 1937. So when the highways are built, one of the things that highway planners looked for was property that was the most inexpensive, so the most cost efficient, and that ended up being, of course, those neighborhoods that in the 1930s had been classed as high risk for rents. So that's one of the reasons the interstate in downtown Indianapolis is a sort of weird meandering snake as it comes down out of the northwest side, and it went through primarily African American neighborhoods, certainly on the northwest side. Although it goes through neighborhoods like Fountain Square, of course, which have a very wide representation of all sorts of Hoosiers.
Okay, and I would like to ask you about how you can use archaeology to study the intersection of racism and material culture.
Well, I think one of the things, I define archaeology relatively broadly as all materiality. It doesn't really have to be something at the trowel tip under the ground, although that's certainly part of what I do. But when I would like students and faculty and visitors to IUPUI, when they come to the campus, they don't see any historical structures anymore because that neighborhood was erased between about the mid-1950s and the very early 1980s. So there's nothing left. So they don't see a heritage, so they don't believe it's a historical neighborhood, but there are plenty of descendant community folks who feel stakeholder status in that neighborhood and feel a connection to the place, even though it may not look like a historical place. So I'm interested in kind of defining materiality broadly and reminding people that it may be a parking lot today, but it was once a club or a house or a church or a school for a century or more in many cases.
Can you give me some examples of artifacts that you might find or remains of buildings?
Well, there are big artifacts and there are little artifacts. The latter, those little artifacts recovered through archaeological excavation, are anything people would have thrown away. And we've done excavations on the IUPUI campus, and we have a very wide variety of everyday material culture that may include things like food remains, bottled goods, ceramics, all the things we would expect to find on a historic archaeological site. The big artifacts are things like parking lots, empty spaces, all of those absences, the landscape itself and how it was created by IU and IUPUI afterwards. Those are artifacts as well that were created for very different kind of ideological reasons.
Now, I think a lot of people don't really associate archaeology with an urban landscape, and it has been my experience that people think if there's a parking lot that's been paved or new construction that's there, that there's nothing left. But there are remnants under there that you just can't see.
Yeah, and actually, construction of parking lots from a purely archaeological preservation perspective really preserves stratigraphic remains incredibly well. When parking lots were built at IUPUI, for instance, and this is true along the avenue as well, generally they just push buildings over, they salvaged some material, they took some stuff to the dump, but generally they just pushed stuff into cellar holes and then filled it over with gravel and asphalt. So it's very well preserved.
Like a cap over a time capsule.
It's Pompeii, just a little different kind of fill. It's not volcanic fill.
It's Hoosier fill.
Exactly.
So when these communities were pushed out for construction of new buildings and campus and redlining, where did they go?
In Indianapolis, most folks stay in town because they're connected to family, they have friends, they have schools, they have church congregations that they don't want to leave. Some people do leave central Indiana. They may go to a place like Chicago, they may go north, they may, settle into the countryside, but more folks go to the west and northwest sides of campus than any other direction. So some folks go to Hawville, for instance. Some folks go to the northwest side as those neighborhoods gradually began to integrate after about 1960 or thereabouts.
Okay. Can we talk a little bit about how important Indiana Avenue was to this community?
Well, Indiana Avenue is the heart of the segregated Black community in Indianapolis. There are African Americans who live all over the city. It's worth keeping that in mind. But they're generally, after 1900, in relatively segregated pockets in a handful of places. And most African Americans are living really on the near west side. And the center of that neighborhood really was Indiana Avenue. This is where we would have found every possible consumer product. We would have found leisure venues like theaters and clubs. And there are churches sprinkled along just off of the avenue in the residential neighborhoods around there. Virtually all of that is gone today. I mean, the Walker Theater has been preserved. Ransom Place is a tiny little fragment of what that neighborhood looked like. So there are tiny little pieces of it, Fayette Street as well, that are still preserved. But there's very little of it for us to see right now. And I think that's one of the things that archaeology can do is we can begin to build a consciousness that there was a heritage to this place. And ideally, we can intervene with developers and begin to do development up and down the avenue in the future that will integrate an understanding of this as a Black place, and Black heritage would be part of development instead of simply putting cookie-cutter apartment buildings up and down the avenue.
So the community is working with, who are they working with?
We've worked with, since I arrived here in 1999, I've always had an oral history project that was part of the program. This is the distinctive part about doing archaeology of the very recent past, is I also have an ethnographic oral historical component. I can talk to people who lived in these neighborhoods. So we've always done oral historical interviews. Some of those elders have passed since the program began, but there still are people around to talk to. So we have a lot to work with. We have a lot of oral history in which people have talked about these are the things that are important in their experience. These are the places they went. This is a church that shaped their life. This is what school meant. This is what the importance was of Crispus Attucks, for instance. So we have a lot to work with to kind of build a thoughtful development on the part of the city and private developers.
So archaeology focuses on material culture, but also there are other ways to do research associated with that.
Yeah, so for instance, I've worked with the community since I arrived here in Indianapolis in 1999. I've always done oral history with elders. I've always worked with descendant community. I've always worked with elders who actually work for the state and for the university as well. So I have a kind of a variety of historical perspectives on the development of the Near West Side. And we have an enormously rich primary documentary base that increasingly is being digitized. So we have lots and lots of primary materials to work with, and more of it is floating to the surface all the time. So we have quite a lot of material to work with. This is a little different than the kind of stereotype of prehistoric archaeology where we have some oral memory, we have some oral heritage, tribal heritage, but we have no primary documents per se. And then in historic archaeology, we have a lot of that sort of stuff to work with.
I love that many people and communities, it seems like they come together to sort of preserve that history and make sure that it is known and people do remember it and they can tell people about it.
Yeah, and I think we want to, I think what the Archaeology Project does is we channel that a little bit. There are lots of people for whom this heritage is very consequential. They pass it down generation to generation within families, but it often doesn't get communicated outside of small communities or outside of the family itself. And I think we give a little bit of a platform to tell those stories to broader publics that might otherwise not hear them.
I think that is so important. If we have the possibility for louder voices or more opportunities, that we give those opportunities to those communities so they can speak to that. I love that.
Sure. The best part of my job is working with descendant community and elders. This is the coolest part, and this is why I always did historic archaeology. I like the ethnographic dimension. I like dealing with people who are committed to the heritage. And I like the idea that we could shape things like development. We can shape the way we tell these these stories in the future.
Well, Paul, thank you so much for speaking with us today and sharing your research for the history of Indianapolis.
Thank you very much for having me.